So the next session is a three-person panel on evaluation. The timing is we've got about an hour and a quarter, and the expectation, I think, is that each panelist will take about 15 minutes or so, and then we'll have questions at the end of all three. So first up, we're going to have Melissa Gymrek talking about the middle author dilemma. And then actually we're going to go slightly out of order to the printed program. We're going to go Melissa first, but then we're going to jump to the third one, which is credit and accountability by Veronique, and then the second one listed. So Melissa started her own lab recently as an assistant professor at the University of California, San Diego, Department of Computer Science and Engineering, and the Department of Medicine. And her major research interest is to understand complex and repetitive genetic variants that underline phenotypic changes, ultimately leading to human disease. So today she's going to talk about the challenges in giving credit to individuals that participate in multidisciplinary research, and particularly why that's a difficult and important challenge for early career researchers who have job applications and grant funding hanging off of that kind of collaboration. So, oh, sorry, I thought I thought you were Melissa standing there. Okay, thank you.
Thanks a lot. I'm very excited to be here and really hear about some of the great solutions we can come up with about how you can give credit to people that participate in multidisciplinary studies. As an early career researcher myself, getting credit for things is a big deal. And we're almost taught to be kind of little CV machines where our goal is to become obsessed with getting first authorship publications rather than sometimes the actual science itself. As a graduate student, and now as I start my own group, I have opportunities to participate in a lot of multidisciplinary collaborations, and I see my peers in these situations as well. And what I've really been struck by is the current system in which we give credit to people is almost obsessed with people building up their personal images or their personal profiles as scientists, and almost penalizes these types of multidisciplinary collaborations. So I just wanted to give a quick outline of what I want to touch on. So I want to first go over the system by which we give credit to people, and then look at how that gets complicated and maybe not the best for rewarding big collaborations. And then think about ways in which we might start to improve on that system. And I know we're going to hear a lot more over the course of this session about some creative ways to start improving things. So I think we're all kind of aware of this, but authorship is really the currency of academia. For instance, if you're applying for a job, you're not even going to get an interview at a place unless you have a stellar publication record with many first author or last author publications to show for what you've done. You're going to have a hard time getting grants without a great publication record. Even after you've gotten a job, you have a lot of responsibilities as a group leader. You have to teach, you have to mentor, you have to do service, but none of those really matter unless you have a great research and publication record to back up what you're doing. Publications are also important for recognition in your field by your peers. So especially for early career research people, publications and especially first or last authorship publications are really critical. So I just got done looking for a job, and I thought it would be fun to share some actual quotes that I heard along the way during this process. And this first one is my favorite one. It says, if you don't have at least 3 first author Nature, Science, or Cell publications, we're just going to throw your application in the trash. I don't think this is actually true, and certainly not for every search committee, but it does say something. A lot of times search committees are looking at 300 or 400 different applications, and they need a quick way to weed out who are the people they want to interview. So this is an easy way to do it. If you have 3 first author publications in these journals, then we're going to keep you, otherwise you're gone. A little harsh and kind of scared me, but anyway. So another one was, we do consider co-first author papers, but we only count them as half when counting publications. So people are literally counting up on your CV how many first author publications you have. You get half for this. I don't know what happens to middle author publications. But maybe this last quote will speak to that. Middle author papers don't really count much. So as a trainee, if I have the opportunity to either help a buddy out and collaborate on a project and contribute to something where I'm going to end up being the 5th author on the paper, rather than just spending my time on my own project where I don't have to collaborate, why would I choose the middle author situation if this is what I'm up against when I'm looking for a job or trying to get grants or trying to get promoted? So I think it's a good idea to just review how the system works before we start looking at how it gets complicated. So at least in biology, where I'm from, authorship kind of looks like a sandwich. So I call this the sandwich approach to authorship, where if you look from the beginning, going from the first author, you usually have who did most of the work. Maybe it's a postdoc or a grad student that did some experiments or ran some analyses. From the other end, and I'm sorry for the slides are a little bit messed up from a Mac conversion issue, but from the other end, you get the senior authors who led the project, maybe they funded the project, maybe they came up with the idea. This person tends to be the corresponding author. In the middle, you get a bunch of other collaborators, maybe staff or students that also contributed to the study. But this can get pretty complicated pretty quickly. You can have multiple first authors or co-first authors, where you say, okay, these guys contributed equally, let's give them equal credit. You can have co-senior authorship, where you say these 2 individuals co-supervise the work equally. And then you can have a big mess in between, where nowadays you can get from dozens to 100 middle authors in between that might have made critical contributions to the study, but are kind of left in this no man's land in the middle. So these middle authors might have made critical contributions to the study, but really the system is built to reward the first and the last author, who get a pretty good deal out of this, where the other people might not necessarily get the credit they deserve for working on this type of study. So how can we objectively give all of the authors the credit that they deserve? Well, I don't know if there is a perfect objective approach to doing this, but I thought it would be interesting to bring up this example of someone that has tried. So this is an example from Stephen Koslin's lab at Harvard, where they came up with a point system for authorship. So based on what kind of different contributions you made to the paper, you might get different numbers of points. If at the end of the day you come up with a minimum of 10% of the total points, you get to be an author. Otherwise, you get kicked out to the acknowledgement section. And the order of the authorship is just determined by the points. It seems pretty easy, right, and pretty straightforward. But I think it's not actually always that easy or straightforward. A big issue with this is that we don't actually know who did what when we look at the authorship order. Also, someone that is looking at your CV to evaluate you isn't going to care how many points you had in the system. So it might be good for internally in the lab figuring out who should be an author, but outside of that, unless it's a universal system, it might not work that well. Papers are starting to get really complicated. A single paper can have dozens or hundreds of authors. And as an example from the types of studies that I and my peers collaborate in, a single paper might involve maybe an experimental biologist that does all the wet lab experiments, a medical doctor that comes with patient data or knowledge of the disease being studied, a statistician, a mathematician, a software engineer, a data scientist that were critical for getting the data analysis done. All these people might be very critical to the success of such a study, and no single one of these individuals could have done such an entire study themselves. Our system for getting credit ought to reward this type of collaboration, but often I think it really doesn't. So I thought it'd be useful to go through just a couple of case studies of how this can get complicated and not necessarily ideal. And I really wanted to use real-life examples from kind of fights that I've seen over authorship, but I decided it would be a bad idea to use real people's names here, so I'm keeping it anonymous. But the first example is co-first authorship. And I've seen this over and over again, especially in genomics where I'm from, where you have a study that has a really big experimental component and a really big computational component. The study couldn't have been done without the contributions of both sides, and both sides kind of did equal amount of work and could have deserved first authorship. So we solved the problem by giving people co-first authorship, by putting a little asterisk next to their name. And this kind of solves the problem of who should be first author. We can just share it between individuals, but it ultimately disadvantages someone. The person that's actually listed as co-first first is often going to get the citations. You're going to often cite the paper as first author at all, rather than first author and first co-author. In print, someone has to be listed first. We are starting to come up with creative ways around this, maybe randomizing the order of co-first authors, or allowing you to list on your CV yourself as a co-first author, but still the system's not perfect. This is another example of the example of large consortia. And this is an example of the 1,000 Genomes Project, a consortium that I played a small part of. But I thought it would be interesting to just show you the author list here. So this entire list is all the authors that contributed to the paper of the 1,000 Genomes Project. The actual paper itself is maybe a couple thousand words, and then you get dozens to hundreds of pages of supplemental material written by all of these many authors. Each of these authors might have put in enough work to get their own first author publication out of this, but instead they end up being the 201st author on this large consortia study. It's really hard for, say, search committees to figure out what an individual person did, and it becomes very confusing. And I think that's not ideal, because that might convince early career people who would rather be getting their own first author publications to show for the work not to participate in such a big project. A third example is another favorite. It's a little bit different, but the example of gift authorship, where you put an extra author on the author list just for the heck of it, maybe as a favor. Maybe that person contributed funding, but they didn't actually do anything for the study. Maybe that person happens to advise one of the students that on the study, but he or she didn't do anything themselves. And I think this is also confusing in how you give credit to people, especially if that person getting the gift authorship is a well-known individual. Someone might think that he or she played a major role in designing and carrying out the study, and not give credit to the people that actually deserve it. So how can we start and change this system and give credit in a way that we actually encourage this type of collaboration? I don't have a perfect solution. I hope we can come up with some exciting things today, but I'll just throw out a couple of ideas. One idea that's already happening is, well, we can just explicitly describe what each person did, and shouldn't that get rid of a lot of the confusion? A lot of authors are now requiring or strongly encouraging you to put a contribution section where you actually point out who did what. And I think this is a really great step. But again, when people are evaluating 400 CVs, they're not going to go to each of these papers and read this section. So unless there's a way to really point this out quickly to people that are trying to evaluate you, it might not end up making a big difference. Another idea that I've been thinking a lot about lately is this idea of, what if we make things, instead of these monster publications, somehow have smaller citable units to them? So if you have a huge study that had 100 authors that ends up with 100 pages of supplemental material, each chunk of the supplemental might itself be something that's actually really important, that could be citable and give people proper credit for that sort of thing. And one example way that I've seen this done is the example of having supplemental, quote-unquote, chapters to a larger study, where each of those chapters has its own individual author list that describes a discrete chunk of the work that was done for that study in such a way that it's clear what those individuals contributed to the study. And I just wanted to bring up an example that the RIKE Lab has been doing this a lot. I know it also happens for a lot of consortium where you get these supplemental chapters. This still is not ideal. Technically, there's no correct citation for each of these supplemental chapters that I know of. I still point it out on my CV, but it's not something that's going to show up in, say, PubMed or have a DOI associated with it. But I think it's a step in the right direction. Along those same lines, I think another way besides getting smaller publication units is also being able to cite things that are not necessarily publications. And we are coming up with ways to do this. The example that comes first to my mind is the example of source code. And one example I've come into a couple times is you have really large consortium or a really large study involving medical collaborators and experimentalists and data analysts and software engineers, and maybe a software engineer built a big important pipeline to process all of the data for the study. And that pipeline is something that wants to be made open source for other researchers to use. It was really critical to this study. That software engineer that led that project is almost certainly not going to be the first author or the last author of this publication. He or she's going to be a middle author somewhere buried. And the contribution is going to be lost. If someone wants to cite that pipeline, since there's no citation for the pipeline, they're just going to cite this larger study, not giving proper credit to the actual software engineers that worked on this. So one potential solution is if the source code itself were citable. And we're coming up with ways to do that. One new kind of tool is called Zenodo, where you can get a DOI for individual software repositories. This is great because software engineers get credit on GitHub for what they've contributed. Their pipeline could get cited rather than the main paper that wasn't particularly about the pipeline in order to give them credit. Another project that I'm just starting to get involved in is called JOSS, the Journal of Open Source Software, that makes it easier for developers to quickly get out publications about their software by writing just a quick abstract where really what gets evaluated is the source code itself, its usability, its documentation, things that a software engineer values, rather than wasting extra time to make an extra publication out of that software. We can also cite things besides software and publications, say data or presentations or even posters using tools like Figshare, and I think that's becoming more and more prevalent. So just to summarize, authorship order is a tricky issue, but it's really important, especially for early career researchers, but really for all scientists, and getting credit and also thinking about our incentives to work on different types of studies. I don't have a perfect solution to this, and I'm excited to hear what we can come up with to make the system a little bit better. So I'd just like to acknowledge people I've had discussions with about these topics, and I look forward to the discussion later on the panel.
Thank you very much. So next up we have Veronique Kiermer on credit and accountability. Veronique has a PhD in molecular biology. She's the executive editor at PLOS, where she's responsible for the editorial direction and editorial policies of PLOS. Before joining PLOS in 2015, she was the executive editor and director of author and reviewer services for Nature, Nature Publishing Group, and there she oversaw editorial and research integrity policies across the Nature journals. So today she's covering tools that publishers have at their disposal to facilitate better evaluation practices, ORCID, the credit taxonomy, and data citations. So over to you, Veronique.
Thanks, Pete, and I want to thank the organizers for inviting me, but also for having a session on evaluation. I actually think that evaluation is a critical criteria and a critical parameter in the success of this social movement that Heather was talking about yesterday. And to a large extent, it's beyond the control of people in this room. But I hope that what I'm going to try to convince you is that there are small steps that we can, as publisher, take. For full disclosure, I also currently serve on the board of ORCID. So evaluation is critical. I think Melissa made the case for that. It's absolutely, we as publisher who stand for open access and open science exist in an environment where the authors are actually at the mercy of this evaluation system, which is not conducive to open science. It's not conducive to collaboration. And you know, this is a quote here. You've heard the perspective from Melissa, which I felt was incredibly compelling from an early career researchers. Here's a quote from people who are a bit more advanced in their career in this article with these 4 illustrious authors in 2014 in PNAS, Bruce Alberts, Mark Kushner, Shirley Tingham, and Harold Varmus. This quote illustrates the problem of the current incentive system, this evaluation system here. And basically what it says is really that we are, as you've heard from Melissa, we are incredibly reliant on a single real value of academic credit, which is the first author paper in a small subset of journals. And you know, to their credit, these high-impact journals are actually doing a lot to try to improve the reproducibility of what they publish. But it's not just their disturbing behaviors. And it's a barrier to collaboration, you've just heard it. Another example that can be witnessed at the moment, there is a lot of discussions ongoing, a big debate ongoing after the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors was bold enough to suggest that data associated with clinical papers needed to be made available 6 months after publication. And that bold statement has generated reactions, angry reactions from some subsets of the community. And it's not necessarily about making the data available. It's about making the data available only 6 months after publication. And there are people out there arguing that it should be longer, it should be 2 years, or perhaps it should be 5 years, because they need the time to get the academic credit from that data. And I think that this is extremely pervasive and it's perverse. And we really need to try to. But the point is that that's the system of academic credit that we evolve in. So we can't control that system. As publishers, we're not in control of the system of evaluation. But I want to argue that actually there are things we can do to at least promote and to facilitate better practices of evaluation. So I'm going to give you a few examples. I'm going to talk about 4 different things. They're not solving the problem, right? These are little steps, but I hope there are little steps in the right direction. And I think this community has a very important role to play in that. Here is a first example. Recently, a number of representatives from journals, very diverse journals, worked with a researcher, Stephen Curry, which we all have to thank for his leadership in this, and a bibliometrician, Vincent Larivière. And as you can see, I mean, you recognize the names of some people who are in the room here. We had journal representatives from PLOS, from Science, from eLife, from Embo Press, from Nature, and from the Royal Society. These very diverse journals got together to actually set out a call for action. And the action is very simple. It's actually to, if you are advertising your impact factor as part of the promotion of your journal, you should display the complex data that gets into the calculation of that impact factor in the form of a citation distribution. And here are the citation distribution of all these journals I've just lined up. And what you can see here is that all these curves have a very similar shape. And it just, I mean, the first thing it highlights is that the impact factor being an arithmetic mean of this distribution, it's not exactly the right distribution to calculate a mean out of, because the distribution is extremely skewed, with an overrepresentation of papers that are that have low citations, and then a long tail of papers that have higher citations. And depending on how long that tail is, it actually drives the impact factor, the average, which is the impact factor. So the point here is, you can see the shapes are, the curve, the distributions are a little different. You can spot probably, nature and science being quite different from PLOS One and scientific reports. But you also can see the massive overlap between all of these journals. And so what the call for action to publish this is just to say, to all the evaluators out there, you can't just take the name of the journal or the impact factor as the measure of the validity. You have to go down to the level of the paper. And it may seem like a very trivial statement, but it's actually not being applied in practice. So I think that that's the first call to action to all of the publishers here. Go and publish your citation distributions. And I think that by raising awareness, we're not allowing evaluators to actually just take that as an easy way. Now, so we're going down granularly from the journal name to the article. Obviously, there are many authors on papers, and this is the trend is increasing. This is just on PLOS Biology. In 2016, on average, there are 7 authors per paper, with a large number of papers that go to up to 20 is actually the whisker there. So it's not uncommon to have a large number of authors, and obviously there are a lot of issues because these authors are identified by their names, which, depending on where you're born and depending on how you spell your name, can actually have a lot of difficulty to unambiguously attributing papers to authors. So this is where ORCID comes into account. And again, I think ORCID really providing this open research and contributor identifier as a persistent identifier unique to an individual is really there to provide an infrastructure and a solution for the name ambiguity that authors have to fight with. But obviously, again, I mean, ORCID is incredibly successful. It's the most successful of any identifier initiative that has ever been attempted. There are now more than 2.5 million ORCIDs in the registry. But still, it's going to only be completely useful when we have that critical mass. It's still a portion of the researchers here. And so at the beginning of this year, again, a group of publishers got together and said, can we speed up the adoption of ORCID? Can we actually play a role in this? And so PLOS and a number of others signed this open letter committing themselves to require ORCIDs from their authors. And we wanted to make sure that we did this right, because the worst thing that could happen is polluting this ORCID registry with a lot of wrong ORCIDs or duplication, etc. So we've worked with ORCID and with Crossref, and basically where we are requiring publishers to do 2 things. Use the ORCID API to collect the ORCIDs so that it's actually a validated, authenticated identifier that you're collecting, not somebody typing something in a free text. And then adopting the Crossref author update. And the Crossref author update basically is the fact that if you, as an author, have your ORCID associated with yourself in the manuscript submission system, once your paper is published, the publisher sends this ORCID with the DOI to, and assigns it, packaged it with the DOI to Crossref. And Crossref can then go back to the ORCID record and update the ORCID record for you. So this is a service to author at this point. We're saying, you know, we are asking you to provide an ORCID, but basically what we want, what we're going to give you a service in return, which is that we will update your record for you. And I think it's only if we have these kinds of positive loops that there is really an advantage for authors to do that, and they will realize the advantage of this kind of thing. It's, the author update is effective at Crossref. I think we still have a messaging challenge because Crossref and ORCID have to work together. The authors have to give permission to Crossref to update the record, which is not always obvious. But basically, we have, out of the people who have, we have about, of all the requests that Crossref has, where Crossref has asked for permissions, about half of the authors have replied, 40% have said, yes, please update my ORCID record, and about 10% have denied permission. So I think we still have an awareness and a communication problem there, but I think that this is really going in the right direction. 81,000 articles published in 2016 have been updated in ORCID record through this mechanism. So I think it is working at scale. So here's your second call to action as publishers. Join the signatories. Many more signatories since the original, I think it was 6 or 7 journals decided to do that. Many more signatories have come on board. And it's all you have to do. Get the ORCID API, which is you can probably get through your manuscript tracking system, and make sure that you put the ORCIDs in the Crossref deposits, and we have Crossref people here who can help you do that. So this is the second call for action. I want to talk a little bit more now about this notion that Melissa introduced of author contribution statements. And I completely agree that I think we are starting with author contribution statements to provide a little bit more granularity to what each other author did in the papers. But as Melissa said, these are little text boxes. Usually they're spelled out with the initials of the authors are used because otherwise it uses too much paper, and therefore you have to decode whatever is in the author list and whatever is in the initials that are in the author contribution statements, and that's assuming that people actually are going and reading the papers, including the footnotes. So that's the problem of the author contribution statements, and this is the origin of that initiative credit, which is an open standard for expressing roles that are intrinsic to research, and which was developed under the auspices of the two standard organizations, CASRI and NISO. So here it is. It's really simple. It's 14 terms, and it's simple by design. You may think it's too simple, and it's probably way too simple to express the complexity of contributions to research projects, but we wanted by design to make this simple because we wanted people to adopt it, and there is no reason that this cannot actually evolve over time. This is the first version. You'll note that it includes, but it's not limited to traditional author roles. So it's very important to remember in that this is a taxonomy. It's not a definition of authorship. It doesn't, that definition of authorship remains with the journal and the publisher and the authors. This is not attempting to define what it is to be an author or not to be an author. What this is attempting to do is to qualify that authorship with the substance of the contribution of each author. Importantly, there is a human-readable definition of each of these terms, and there is also a machine-readable piece of code that you can, as a publisher, put in your XML. And that is really what is trying to address the portability issue. The fact that if it is in the XML, then it's portable. It's part of the metadata of the paper, and it can be syndicated with the paper elsewhere, and it can be, and other services can build on that to establish your CVs, to show in your ORCID profile, whatever it is that these services will develop. But it's really the idea that the contribution of each author, and so you really start having those triples. You have the DOI, which is a persistent identifier for the paper, the ORCID, which is the persistent identifier for the person, and the relationship between these two being described by the standard taxonomy. I'll just say a few words about how it actually came about. And basically, it was a long process. It started in 2012. And what's important to remember is that the people who started that were actually varied. There were a few journal editors, and there were evaluators. We had Amy Brandt, which at the time was at the provost office at Harvard, and we had Liz Allen, who was at the evaluation department at the Wellcome Trust. So we had these people interested in evaluating science and really having this issue of determining what did author number 8 on a 23 author paper do, really. And so it was this multiple stakeholders, and we tried to get as much data as we could. So we started with the discipline-specific convention about authorship, and we also took data, and importantly, there were 2 data sets which were quite useful for this. One was the author contribution statements from Nature, 5 years worth of it. Melissa showed an example. It's a free text, so it's really, we did a text mining analysis of this, and of that emerged the terms that authors are using in their own words to actually describe their contributions. And that was very important to start shaping these contributions. And we did the same thing with a data set of acknowledgement that came from Elsevier. So it was quite a diverse task force. We established that. We called on somebody who actually knew something about taxonomies to organize all that. And then we tested it in a survey. We sent survey, several publishers participated. We had about 250 authors responding. And basically what we asked these authors to do was to recode their author list after publication of their paper based on this taxonomy, and to tell us about their experience. And the vast majority, I mean 80% of people said actually it was at least as good or even much better than what they had used to determine and characterize their authorship. So we were fairly confident that that was a good way to go. And this is when CASRAI and NISO stepped in and really helped us having a more systematic, standardized process. So this is how the standard was established, and we've just implemented it at PLOS in July. And so I'm giving you here a distribution. You can't read the different taxonomy terms, but basically this shows the frequency of use of each of these contributions. And what's very important is that the top one here is software, and it's about 42% of papers actually had at least one contributor who contributed software. The largest one is over 90%, and it's conceptualization. So I think what's important here is that all these 14 criteria or contributions are being used in papers and are being used quite frequently. So I think that's a good sign that people are actually paying attention and using it. We had really a small fraction of papers, less than 5%, where it seemed like the response was a bit odd, and we haven't heard anything negative about it yet. So again, an encouragement there to other publishers to try it. And here's how it looks. This is a live paper on PLOS biology. If you actually click on, because it's part of the metadata of the paper, we can expose it as a little pop-up. When you click on the author name, you have the roles followed by the affiliation. Ideally, you'll get the ORCID in that list as well, and that would really provide that. This is on our own website, but we are now ready to start sending that to Crossref and syndicate it with the manuscript. And Crossref has just updated their schema to be ready to take these contributions as well. So again, we're going into that direction. The last things, again, touching on the point that Melissa suggested about smaller citation units, smaller citable units, and to the point I was making earlier about people making their data available. I think if we really are serious about open science, we need to be serious about giving credit to people who actually produce very good data sets. And so trying as a publishing community to establish robust standards for data citation is going to be very important. I want to tip my hat here to the work of Force 11 and the data citation implementation group, who is really working actively on this. and also just mentioned the Thor project, which is an EU project with, DataCite, for example, EBI and Dryad as representative of repositories, a couple of publishers, and the British Library working with us in trying to really establish making these persistent identifiers for people and for data available to authors very easily. So really, in sum, I think we have a few tools. They're not solving the problems, but I hope you agree that we're going in the right direction about raising awareness and promoting and facilitating better practices, and importantly, to enable this to become a machine-readable ecosystem, because then other services can be built on top of that. And it's really about getting granularity from the name of the journal to the paper to the author, to their specific contribution, and giving them credit for these specific contributions. So really, we need to go from this to something which looks a little bit more like the 21st century, where the author is actually at the center of what we're doing, and where we're really having all these contributions that the authors are providing in an ecosystem that is readable and that we can, human and machine readable, that we can then throw that at evaluators and give them better tools to actually look at the actual contributions of people. I have to give credit where credit is due. On the citation distribution, I've mentioned the leadership role of Stephen Curry and Vincent Larivière. You have the other names there. Laurie Ack and Ed Pence from Orchid and Crossref gave me some data. My colleagues at PLOS. And on the credit taxonomy, I want to acknowledge the leadership of Liz Allen, who is now at Faculty of 1000, and Amy Brandt at MIT Press. Thank you very much, and we'll have questions after.
You guys are like perfect. It's perfect.
Okay, thanks, Veronique. Next up, and the third panelist is Melissa Haendel. She's an associate professor in the library and the Department of Medical Informatics and Clinical Epidemiology at Oregon Health and Science University. She's the PI of the Monarch Initiative, which is a biomedical data discovery system, and an active researcher in data standardization, and works very closely on Force 11, of course, and things like the Global Alliance for Genomics and Health. She's going to be talking about her work on representation of attribution beyond authorship of the publication. And she'll talk about the Open Research Information Framework and Force 11 Attribution Working Group. So, over to you. Thank you.
Can't do that one, can you? No, your slides on here. Okay. Do you know they work? They're on a Mac. Yeah, I've got the. Okay. Yeah, it's on PowerPoint. Okay. That's if not. That's okay. Let's have a look. I think that looks okay. Okay. Thanks. So first, I just want to say what a pleasure it is for me to be here. I've just had such amazing conversations with everyone. Thank the organizers for inviting me. It's a very interesting perspective, and I think there's a lot of synergies here that can really help solve some of the big problems in the world. So you guys are an amazing group of people. So today, I'm here on behalf of a number of different groups, but especially the Force 11 Working Group on Attribution that has really tried to extend some of the work that we heard from our earlier speakers and address some of these issues, and I think I probably couldn't have been set up any better by you both at sort of the problems and some of the solutions. So what I want to talk about is really, I don't know how many of you have seen the movie Ratatouille, but in the movie Ratatouille, it's stated, not everyone can become a great artist, but a great artist can come from anywhere. And the nice thing I really like about this quote is to suggest that in research and in science in particular, everyone's contributions matter, and it's the sum and collective unity of those contributions that really make science go. And so I think we heard a little bit about that in Melissa's talk from those many, many author-listed publications. So what is success? What does it mean to be a successful researcher? How do we evaluate research? Well, as we heard earlier, we tend to focus on those first and last author publications, but it's really not always what you see. And in fact, so much of what goes on is not actually in that, lovely, flowery first author publication that you might see here.
So how do we attribute those contributions that might be below ground, so to speak? So I went to Wikipedia, the world's knowledge base, and I looked up the word attribution. And as it turns out, there are multiple definitions for attribution. We have attribution in terms of copyright, so legal attribution, copywriting knowledge, other kinds of licensing artifacts that essentially get attributed to a person or an organization. We have marketing attribution, where concepts that assign value to a certain market component where the portfolio might be behaving better in one context than one might have expected. We have attribution in the context of psychology, where we're trying to attribute certain behavioral aspects of a person to underlying sensations and essentially describe behaviors. We have performance attribution, where it's basically a tech that's related to understanding how the portfolios behave. And then we have journalism sourcing, and I don't think I need to explain that one here. Now, the point is that all of these contexts for attribution are relevant to the researcher. I mean, really, we're talking about human behavior and how we attribute someone's contributions to society. And these are the things that a researcher wants to be attributed for. So how do we do that when we have papers that look like this one, where we have over 1,000 authors on this particular paper? What did these people do? Obviously, it was important enough that they all be added as authors because it's so laborious to add them in the journal submission systems. And I'm hoping that one of you will help solve that problem, because I have a big one coming. So, you know, it's really a problem, as we've heard earlier. How do we? These are every single one of these people were really pivotal for this research to happen. It's a team effort. So how do we do that? Well, we heard already a little bit about Project Credit, and this has been, I think, you know, it was really spearheaded by Liz and Amy, but has really, you know, we've really extended that, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what we've been doing. The ideas that they had originally on how to represent these roles have really, I think, enlightened publishers and researchers and evaluation teams, whether it be for tenure and promotion or writing a grant or, you know, or for awards, and those kinds of things in terms of the types of contributions that people have had. And so it is definitely a really valuable and important tool. And it was very important that it was very simple. The problem, though, is that these roles really represent roles that relate to a manuscript, a paper, authors on a paper. So an example here is that in the US, we have the National Institutes of Health Big Data to Knowledge program. And this new program at NIH started a few years ago, and the idea is to develop a workforce and resources around data science for health research. So because NIH systems are the way they are, I actually emailed every single funded grantee in the entire BD2K program, which were hundreds of people, to find out who were their key personnel on all of their research grants and training programs. And then I did some publication profiling on all of those key personnel, and I found out that more than 20% of the key personnel on the US's, you know, primary data science initiative aren't writing any publications. So what is it that these people are actually doing? They're pivotally important. They are the key personnel in our data science initiative in health research. Well, they're doing a lot of other things. They're writing code, as we heard about earlier, but they're also writing clinical instruments. They're creating surveys. They're doing evaluation. They're providing resources like reagents, organisms, cell lines. They're doing a lot of things that are simply not resulting in authorship on publications. So clearly, if we want to develop a workforce that's capable of, you know, the next generation, you know, efforts in using data for moving science along more effectively and more efficiently, we need to figure out how to credit these people who aren't finding their way into the literature. So the other problem that we have is that some contributions are anonymous. So we have a fair number of examples where data deposition is anonymous. Not only the data is de-identified itself, but the people who deposited it And so that's, getting contributions for that. We've already heard a little bit about the review process and how a lot of the efforts that we go to review all of the articles are anonymous, and there's a number of efforts out there to try to help provide credit for those kinds of contributions. And I think that some improved tooling in this area is certainly great. But the reality is that what it really looks like is it's an ecosystem of contributions that are all very codependent in order to support the research enterprise. So we might have a grant dollar that's written, a PI writes a grant, the grant goes to fund a researcher, the researcher's at one institution, the institution helps support that researcher by providing services and resources. That researcher might create a resource that's used to create another resource that's used by another researcher, and basically, essentially, all of these different types of contributions work together in order to create, the science that actually moves things forward. So I wanted to give you an example of what this type of an ecosystem looks like, and this is actually a real example where the names are not disambiguated, in part because I just don't care anymore. So, because if I don't make my point, it won't ever change. So I work actually in my day job on rare disease computational biology. And I work on a project with the Undiagnosed Disease Program here in the US and a number of other organizations that work on helping patients who have undiagnosable diseases get diagnosed. And we recently helped solve this patient's case to figure out what genetic variation did they have that was causal for their disease. So I wanted to tell you a little bit about that. And this is just a really quick overview, but essentially there was a person, Johannes, who created a mouse. And this mouse, as it turns out, had some similarities to the patient's case. Melissa, I actually curated the patient's data. So I reviewed all of their medical records and built a computational representation of their case in order to be used by our tools. Will, who was a student at the NIH at the time, took my computational model and analyzed the data from the genomic side in combination with my computational model on the clinical side, together with data that we derived from the literature, which included Johannes's mouse. Tom then went and wrote this publication about the diagnosis of this case, and Tom credited Will as an author, but not me. Now, I didn't really mind that much because I was just glad that the patient got diagnosed. But it kind of speaks to the question as to what exactly is the goal here. Is the goal the publication or is the goal the diagnosis? So you can actually model this computationally, and I'm sort of a technical person. You probably can't see all of this, but the point is that here's the publication that relates to Tom, and here's the diagnosis that relates to Tom, because Tom was the clinician who made the diagnosis. And here we have these roles that relate these things. So over here, he's an author on this publication, and over here, he's got a clinician role because he's made this diagnosis, right? So this publication can be related to this data set that was generated by Will. So there's Will over here, who also has an authorship relationship to that paper, and he's got a data analysis type of role here. And then over here we have me, and I actually created this, curation role or sort of a computational model creation role that was used by this analysis. And similarly up here, here's Johannes. So by building a computational model of these roles, basically the same type of roles that we heard about in the credit taxonomy, we can actually infer that both Johannes and I played a role in not only the publication, but the diagnosis of this patient. So what really matters then? Is it the publication or the diagnosis? So who all contributed? I actually analyzed this patient's case, and I went back to NIH and collected all the names of all the people that contributed to the diagnosis of this case. And these are all the people. There's around 100 people or so, and they come in different roles. There's clinicians and clinical care people who are not authors on the publication. There were pathologists who helped evaluate the tissue specimens, both from the mouse and from the patient. There are ontologists, that's me, people who actually build the computational models that allow analysis. There's a lot of computer scientists that built the software to help do the analysis, people who actually managed all of the data, as well as the basic researchers that contributed to the underlying basic research data that was actually used for the diagnosis. So this is the reality of the situation, and we want to give all of these people credit for helping move biology forward and helping solve a really important patient's case. So now they can go and hopefully find the best treatment possible and find other patients like themselves in the world, which make a really big difference for these cases. So how do we enable this sort of thing? So this is just, there's many other related efforts, but some of the key landmark occasions here were to try to take what was started with the credit taxonomy, and we had this workshop in 2014, and extend that to a more computational model of contribution, and include additional roles that could be used in a variety of other contexts that for items that wouldn't necessarily result in a publication. So things like software code, those clinical instruments, resources, reagents, a variety of, and we did this across all disciplines, so it also includes things like, art artifacts like plays and other kinds of works of art. So really taking a very broad swath. The Force 11 working group met at Force 2015 in Oxford, and you can see there a number of participants from across those different disciplinary boundaries created over 500 different kinds of things that they wanted credit for. So really the kinds of roles that if we really wanted to understand what people want credit for, there's a lot more than just the 10 or 15 that we might put in an author list. But at the same time, having 500 of them is really an untenable situation. But we want to be able to give people opportunities to reference what exactly the types of contributions they have. And so this has been extended through a variety of other workshops that have happened throughout the last year or so. At the VIVO conference, which is a research profiling tool, which allows the representation of a research profile and a person's contributions in a variety of contexts, so courses, textbooks, publications, grants, patents, but a variety, works of art, other kinds of things. It's been tailored for a number of different types of institutions and disciplines. OpenRIF, which I'll talk about in a minute, as the newly minted Open Research Information Framework, which provides a structure to connect people and organizations to all these different types of contributions. And then also the NISO Alt Metrics Initiative, which has just put out some draft recommendations that are based on all of the outcomes that came from these earlier workshops. And so this is just an example of some of the outputs that people wanted credit for. In particular, these ones were the ones that were related to software. So if you're a software developer, the credit taxonomy term software development is really insufficient for evaluation for your particular, context, whether it's, getting a position or, trying to receive funding or the like. They're very specific about the type of kinds of contributions that they want to be recognized for. So we did an experiment at the last Force 16 conference. And in this, so I just wanted to talk a little bit about that. In this case, on ontology, a standard, essentially a derivation of the original credit taxonomy has been extended in a variety of ways that can be rolled back up to the original credit taxonomy. So we haven't lost that nice, lovely, simple use case there, but we can now also use it in a more extensive way for these other types of contributions. And what we did here is we used ORCID as a login identifier for the person, and we used Digital Sciences Grid database as a organizational identifier. So similar to using ORCID for a person, we use the grid identifier for an organization. I'd love to hear the publisher's thoughts on what's working best in your communities. But when we did our evaluation, that seemed to be the most robust, highly curated set of organizational identifiers, which we've been hoping for a really long time. So the contribution ontology was then used for all of the Force 16 conference participants to log in to contribute their Figshare all of their conference proceedings. So posters, talks, bits of software code, other kinds of materials that were used in the workshop. So anybody that had any materials related to the conference, put them in Figshare, logged into OpenVivo, created a profile based on their ORCID ID, and then assigned roles to the contributions that they had in Figshare to their profile. And so now all of this data is now available along with 100 or so other institutions around the world in a platform of data that basically takes research profiling data from institutional profiling systems, as well as from some of the biosketch systems like Science CV, and we have a contract with Science CV to standardize the contributions in the biosketch system for federal agencies here in the US. And this is a collaboration with David Eichmann. And so in the end, basically, people are able to create their own research profile in OpenVivo that shows that these alternative types of contributions to these different things. And so this was basically a test to see if it would actually work. And so we've essentially been analyzing the data since April and are just now releasing this new contribution ontology based on that refinement and also based on analysis of acknowledgement section in all of the open access and Elsevier journals that we could get our hands on. So we hope that some of you will join us in helping further this along, and we'll be writing papers and blogs and announcements and the like as soon as it's ready for prime time. So I just wanted to thank really quickly the very many people that helped with this work and the evolution of this work over many years. In particular, Christy Holmes, who's been my partner on the attribution and altmetrics efforts for a long time. Mary Jane White, who works in my group and is now really spearheading the release process. David Eichmann, who's really done all of the data aggregation and analytics on the research profiling data. Amy Brand and Liz Allen, who spearheaded the credit taxonomy. Dan Katz for his wonderful conversations on all the transitive ideas that we have for how to actually build a transitive credit system, as well as all of our colleagues in the various working groups, especially Force 11. We'd love to have people join us, and there's some listserv and working group links there, and these slides are also posted on SlideShare. So thanks very much.
Hi, and thank you for the really thought-provoking presentations. I really do believe that changing the crediting system is going to have a big impact on all the flaws of the current system. So big props for the message. I have a comment and a question for you. The comment is that obviously the ideal world that we have in Wikipedia or in GitHub, where there are traces that can be just used for measuring contributions, like quantitatively, cannot be applied to most science because we're not in a world in which every single contribution leaves traces behind. But I think, like, wearing my altmetrics hat, that if we were to think of ways in which we can leverage a shared piece of infrastructure for authoring, for every step in the peer review or content production workflow, that data would be measurable, and I think would have even richer data that we could use to better substantiate these different roles. So that's the first comment. The question for you is, I'm very interested in all the credit taxonomies and approaches. What are your thoughts about the best strategies to scale up adoption from the publisher end, from the contributor end? I'm curious about what you think is going to be most effective.
Well, I think, in part it really depends on all of you in the publishing context to really start piloting things in your systems. I think from our experience, and even when we had, a more robust, larger set of roles for people to choose, once it actually gets pushed to a public site where people are like kind of showing what they look like, the response rate's really high, because people want their profiles to look good, right? So it's kind of like, a little bit of gamification or peer pressure in those contexts can go a long way. So when you go to LinkedIn or one of those other types of sites, and it says, oh, your profile's only 80% complete, or, users like you also said stuff like this, there's these kind of prompts to help people feel obligated to finish completing those things. we can have actually really good compliance. It's just that there's, got to be a sort of collective investment in trying to make these things happen. From the computational side, as someone who integrates all of the data from the journals, I would love it if there could be a slightly more structured approach to sharing this information. And so, I think also considering the downstream usage of this data and how it's going to be applied in the informatics context, where we can actually really make bold statements about, what we're seeing in terms of the evaluation, will also incentivize authors to want to actually tag those types of things. At the same time, we recognize that, we don't want to burden authors any more than we do. But I think the credit thing is one of the least burdensome aspects of submitting a paper, and people really want their credit. So I think that part should be pretty easy to overcome.
I'm just going to add something to your point about having a public site and thing. I think it's actually important because, I do think, the idea with adopting the simple 14 terms as part of the submission process is also to raise awareness about these issues. It's about, making, so I think that it's an important step. It has a lot of caveats, right? And one of the biggest caveats, and I'm curious to see what the other Melissa think about it, but it's also that the person who interacts with the manuscript tracking system is usually the corresponding author, or, it's one of the list of authors, right? And ideally, that's not the point at which you decide authorship. You should really have decided that way earlier. And so exposing this, but what we've seen in some of the responses to the survey we did when we were exploring this, was that people were saying, well, this is actually a great framework to think about authorship. And had I known, I would have thought about that before actually writing. So I think that if we can push that upstream and have it as a tool for people to, when they are collaborating on a project, to really use that framework, and the more granular the framework, the better, if it all rolls up to the simple thing, I think that might start driving more, because then you're also in control and you can discuss and have these important, authorship disputes are horrible, and you're not, this doesn't solve it, but if we have the framework for discussion, I think it could be a good way forward.
I think you touched on a good point, and really a lot of the authorship disputes I've seen, a big problem is just not communicating about it, and then you get to the point of deciding authorship, and no one really spoke up, and people end up getting hurt. But if you have this sort of a framework where you decide beforehand, you're doing this, you're going to get this credit attached to it, that can really solve a lot of these disputes. At the same time, I think it's dangerous to say, promise someone authorship in this sort of a way beforehand, and then it gets to publication time, that person didn't end up doing what they were supposed to do, but they were somehow promised first authorship on this paper, and then you end up with another fight. So I think it's just important to keep the communication open and be clear about who's contributing what throughout the whole process.
So first, I'd like to thank you for the panel. It's very interesting to me because I think a lot about attribution and ethics, and I think it's very applicable in terms of the scholarly publishing and communications life cycle. So it's something that sometimes it gets forgotten, so thank you. So I'm a librarian, but also a faculty member, so this is very interesting to me, and I realize this question is not really that solvable right now, but I'm interested to hear your thoughts. Do you have any opinion on how we can move this conversation more to the tenure guideline level? Because obviously the middle author problem, or having our job postings and applications denied because we don't publish and sell, that's not something that we can solve right away, and that's more on the provost and tenure guideline level. Do you have any thoughts on that?
So yes, actually many. So first of all, my colleague Christy Holmes, who I mentioned, she's the director of the library at Northwestern, at Galter Library. And at Northwestern, they now have used those 500 roles that are represented for their new tenure and promotion guidelines for faculty at Northwestern. So it's a huge, step forward. So I'm happy to put you in touch with her, and you can talk to her about how she actually realized that. And we're trying to do that now at our university. I'll also tell a little quick story, and that is, I think that we need to be changing the way that we represent ourselves, kind of just outright. I applied for a really, important award recently. I didn't get it, but the award said you could put your 3 most important publications in listed and explain why they were so important and what your role was in them. And I put one that was a first author publication, one that was a last author publication, and one that was a middle author publication. And my advisors who were trying to help me get this award were like, that's crazy, you should never do that. And I said, but if I don't do it, nobody else is ever going to do it. And my cog in the machine is really important. Without my having done my bit, this really important paper would never have been published. So I think we all can look to our past history and how we represent ourselves and do similar kinds of things and tell our tenure and promotion committees about why these middle author publications are so important.
No, that's the sort of thing that I'm thinking of exactly, so thank you.
I think that's a really interesting approach and requires a lot of bravery, but I think that's a really important and relevant step. I've actually just been involved in a lot of conversations. I'm starting a new job, and people tell me it's incredibly frustrating. They tell you, your job is to get tenure, your job is to churn out as many last author publications as you can. And I'm just, coming out of conversations like these that I have with my peers all the time, these conversations with my mentors now are incredibly frustrating. So I think, we really need to make a change in the attitude of the people that sit on these committees and decide the guidelines. But like Melissa said, we can't just sit back and be a slave to the system. We have to do something about it, even if it requires a little bit of bravery on our part to emphasize publications that might not be the obvious ones to emphasize.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hi, I'd also like to really thank you for this great session. I just want to give a little of my experience. I've been in academia for 25 years, and working in collaborative groups is so much more productive, at least it's been my experience, and particularly over years, that I think you really have to take the big picture, and beyond that, use what my wife likes to say, what they taught you in kindergarten, and that work it out, share credit. You be first author this time, I'll be next time, and share it. And again, as Melissa pointed out, deciding that real early on the process saves a lot of bad feelings. Somebody's feelings might be hurt a little bit if you do it at first. You wait towards the end, and that can blow up a group that's working together really well and create a lot of bad feelings. So yeah, it's a collaborative process, and working together and sharing credit is everybody wins.
Hi, let me echo everybody's thanks for this terrific panel, and it's a subject that's really close to my heart, so I've been thrilled to hear about this progress. And getting back to this issue of evaluators, I was at an NSF workshop not too long ago that was talking about how to provide credit to computational software developers, and the discussion kind of evolved towards this, well, what could we do besides authorship to acknowledge the incredible contributions that people are making, but that don't really fit nicely into the paper that comes out of it. And the concept came up of prizes. And you just mentioned an example where you applied for an award, but it was it counted authorship as the thing that got you the award, right? So I want your opinions about whether we as a community, societies, universities, publishers, could develop a set of alternative awards, like prizes for people, and a different way of assessing contribution, like the number of projects that you as a data scientist made a critical contribution to. And we can use things like credit to help evaluate that, but is that even possible? Why do we keep assuming that authorship is the only I'm sorry, babbling, but you know what I mean. And then I can go to promotion and tenure committees and say, look, this person got all these awards, isn't that cool? So that might actually be the sort of shortcut that they're looking for. And I'll stop now and ask for your thoughts.
So I think a couple things. One is that, we count authorship in publications and sometimes grants and patents because they're easy to count. It's the easy thing, right? The other kinds of contributions are really hard. And sometimes they might relate to a paper, and sometimes they're, more societal level kinds of contributions. So I think, just starting to build some of the infrastructure to help aggregate some of these contributions, they need to be named and identified so that they can be aggregated in profiles so that people can go and find them. Our new tooling that we have that aggregates data that we just built for the BioSketch system for the NIH, can pull data from SlideShare and from GitHub and from a number of different places, right? So we can actually point at the things. So I think that's part of it is, pointing at those things. And even without a computational infrastructure for that, you can still list all of those things. For a long time, I used to do a lot of gene sequencing. I put all of my GenBank submission identifiers on my CV. I'm sure that I was the only person that ever applied for any jobs that did that, and then there was too many of them to do it anymore. But, so whatever your thing is, I think you need to profile that. I think prizes are great. It still seems, though, that a lot of these prizes, another good example was the Open Science Prize recently, still valued mostly on publications and impact of those publications. We just have to find other ways of understanding value systems that go beyond those publications, or almost declare that we are not going to use that in those contexts. So, for that 25% or so of people that are data scientists that are key personnel here in the U.S., let's look at those things and say how to evaluate them. There's another little quick story. There was a story, I forget what the company was, but they had an anonymous application for a really important software engineer position. I'm not sure if you're all familiar with this, where the student who won this amazing competition turned out to be, an undergrad from a community college. And it was just this wonderful example of how, again, a great chef can come from anywhere.
I think it's important to bring up that different types of contributors think about credit in different ways. For instance, software engineers that want to get their next job don't even care about citations of papers, or don't even want to take the effort to make a publication out of their thing. So we can look at other ways to evaluate that work that's not necessarily publication-based. So I'll just use the example of software. On my CV, I put how many downloads my tools have had, or how many users there are on the user group on Google. Or if you build a web portal, you can keep track of how many people are using that. I don't know if anybody cares or looks at that information, but it's important to me, and it shows me that those tools are successful. I think it's things like that are not traditional citations that can also play a big role.
I just wanted to add something which is related, which is we're really talking about a cultural shift here, and we can do whatever we want with the BioSketch, and if everybody ends up listing their 3 first author, Nature and Cell and Science papers, we're not changing. So it's really about that, but it's also sort of the discipline specific thing. I mean, obviously we've all been coming at this from the biomedical research area. I mean, the physicists have dealt with this in a completely different way. The economists have dealt with it in a very different way as well. But sometimes getting, when we need this cross-disciplinary collaboration, the idea of prizes and things like that might be important. And the example that I have in mind here is talking to statisticians about trying to get statisticians to work with biologists, because we all know biologists need statisticians' help. And I'm a biologist, and really, so having that, and the fact is that you have statisticians who are willing to do that, but then it's not recognized in their own department, because in their own discipline, it's another type of credit that is important. It's first authorship in another kind of journals. And so it's really about showcasing the importance of some contribution, and I think prizes are perhaps a good idea for these sort of specific applications.
Let's make this the last question. Katrina, maybe you can take it to coffee.
So I just want to share, this has been a really interesting presentation, and I want to share that as somebody who's been archiving and curating data for 20 years, I've been taking entire projects and cleaning them from beginning to end because that's how it was given to me. The author is never the person who can give me the answer to my questions, hardly ever. They're always pointing me to the person who did the data cleaning or the person who actually, converted and did the computations for that particular variable. And it's always trying to find out who that person is, which is where this is important, because they're the people that I'm going to be working with to make this data accessible and to make this data make sense to somebody else, which is why it's important, because usually you find these people's names, these other contributors or these other authors, hidden in the administrative records, which doesn't make it easy for me to do my job, but it's never the original PI or the first author who has the answer to my questions.
Here, here.